Professor Wistrich. I'll call now on our last speaker for the evening, Professor Steinberg.
Thank you. I was going to start by saying on this happy note, but I'm not sure that's an appropriate continuation. But I do want to thank the organizers, all the people who came out. The fact that you're in a filled up this large room tells us on this evening, cold evening in Jerusalem, says that there are many people who take this issue seriously, and I think that's an important message, perhaps also for this campus, to understand how important the issues of this form of modern anti-Semitism, of the anti-Semitism directed at the collective Jew, at the state of Israel, is becoming, and how much we need to work on this. I want to thank also both Professor Kotler and Professor Wistrich. Mikol belamdai hiskalti. I've learned from all my teachers, and in this area that I have now not consciously or not deliberately, back when I started after the infamous Durban conference that Professor Kotler was unfortunately a participant in from the Canadian delegation. Not unfortunate that he was, of his contributions, but unfortunate because he had to go to that travesty. But that really was the beginning of my understanding of the need to analyze these issues from a political point of view. And if I have something to contribute, it is precisely from that perspective. I'm going to look at this not only from a political point of view, but also from a micro point of view, from the details, the dirty details, and they are very dirty. How this boycott, this BDS movement actually works. How the types of language that we heard of Israel as a genocide state, as Israel as a state of war criminals, the Durban NGO Forum resolution, the types of language that is being sent to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, the language we hear every time that the United Nations Human Rights Council meets, and we'll hear it again, I'm sure, from William Schabas when he presents his, quote, report, his commission's report, now tentatively set for March 23rd, on the Israeli war crimes in the Gaza war. This is a process that's been going on. Yes, we can go back to 1975, we can go back to 1947, we can go back earlier or later, but certainly from the Durban NGO Forum on, the language that was used then in the NGO Forum, calling for the complete international isolation of Israel as an apartheid state, as a genocidal state, as a state that practices ethnic cleansing, that practices war crimes, that has developed into a huge industry. It's like a sickness, but it's an industry of sickness, and it's very virulent. There are billions of dollars and krona and euros and pounds invested in this industry, year after year, in hundreds of frameworks, non-governmental organizations, NGOs. Sometimes they're called civil society organizations. They're human rights organizations, they're humanitarian organizations. And their central role in driving this campaign for the complete international isolation of Israel. That's the goal. That's what was stated. That's what they're pursuing. And just as it was done at Durban, which was to celebrate the end of apartheid, in quotes, the goal is to celebrate the end of Israel. And it is a huge industry. With all of this money and many organizations, day after day, week after week, in almost every media platform, academic platform, diplomatic platform, you hear this grinding attack against Israel. So it's almost impossible to escape. So much so that now more and more young Jews it's like a Stockholm syndrome. They hear it so often from their professors, in the blogs and on Twitter and on Facebook and on television and every other way. How can it not be right? Israel must be doing terrible things. It must be an apartheid state, the worst state out there committing war crimes, and you hear it over and over again. Most of this industry, unfortunately, a large part of it, is funded by European governments. I talked about non-governmental organizations. There's so many absurd elements of this that have been going on largely under the table, and I'll be explicit in a few minutes, for the last 15 years or so, longer in some ways. Every Western European country, from Spain and Italy in the south to Sweden and Norway, Finland, every Scandinavian country, provides funding either directly in the form of grants to human rights organizations, humanitarian aid organizations, democracy-encouraging organizations, in large amounts taxpayer funds that go to these BDS supporters. These are the organizations, and their officials are the foot soldiers. So if you're, for instance, a member of the British Academic Union, and you go to a union meeting to talk about the annual decisions, the big one is always, should we boycott Israel, more or less, how? And you'll get a pile of handouts before from an organization called War on Want, a humanitarian aid organization, in quotes, supposedly, with a massive budget, British pounds, some of which from the British government, connected to the Church of England and other churches, or from Christian Aid, another one, which will tell you all the terrible things that Israel does. This European money is what keeps the boycott movement, the hate Israel movement, the form of modern collective anti-Semitism, keeps it moving and accelerating. And every day, every week, every month, my colleagues and I at NGO Monitor and other groups uncover yet another layer and yet another layer of where this money is coming from. And I'll give you some illustrations. But in whatever time I have left, it doesn't say 2 minutes upside down, but whatever, 20. There's no way that I can even convey to you the scope and the details of this, but I'll try to do it in a somewhat organized fashion. I want to discuss 4 specific categories in the way this money, this industry works. First of all, and each one deserves, well, I teach a 14-week class, and I could do a lot longer than that. Each one deserves a lot more than the 2 or 3 minutes I'm going to devote to it, just to give you a sense of what's going on here. The first category are groups that call themselves human rights organizations. Back in the 60s, it started off with Amnesty International. Shortly afterwards, Human Rights Watch, 2 nobly founded organizations to promote the values of human rights, the values of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to adopt political prisoners and work for their freedom. These organizations, particularly at the end of the Cold War, have completely lost their moral compasses. To quote one of the founder, really, of Human Rights Watch, then Helsinki Watch, Robert Bernstein. And if you look just at the Twitter feed of the head of Human Rights Watch, an organization that now has a budget of about $60 million. $60 million, not all of it goes to hate of Israel, but a very disproportionate amount does. And a disproportionate number of the leaders of this organization, and particularly Kenneth Roth, the head of the organization, clearly has an obsessive hatred of Israel, hostility towards Israel. And yesterday, if you look almost any day, if you look during the war in July, the Gaza war, at the language that he used, or if you looked yesterday at a couple of his tweets, and they're 140 characters, and I encourage people to look at it because you really unmask what's going on there. But it's same in their reports and their publications and their testimonies and everything else. And he cannot say anything about the victims of terrorism related to Israel or the Middle East without throwing in there, because of the occupation, because of Israeli war crimes in Gaza. There's obviously no connection between the two, between the killing of the Jews in the supermarket in Paris or the massacre of the cartoonists. But Kenneth Roth cannot but show us his deep hostility towards Israel. And that's millions of dollars a year. And almost every possible platform at every meeting of the Human Rights Council, it's constantly lobbying journalists, and it seeps into the New York Times, and it seeps into the Guardian. It's more than seeps into the Guardian. And in almost every other place. And of course, and I'll just put this in parenthesis as part of my introduction. Now I've got to put this on my CV. As the only person, the only Israeli talking head or pundit who was ever banned from the Associated Press because I say things that are critical of these human rights organizations, of Amnesty and Human Rights Watch. We say things that, for instance, that they have no methodology, that their massive reports that are quoted in the United Nations publications about Israeli war crimes have no foundation, in fact, because they don't even know how to do research. It's all a facade. So the human rights organizations, or rather the groups that claim to promote human rights, both the international superpowers, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, and the dozens and hundreds that exist, Israeli groups, Palestinian groups, Al-Haq, Al-Mazan. Al-Haq is run by someone by the name of Shawan Jabarin. Shawan Jabarin is denied entry into Jordan and often exit from Israel because of an alleged connection with a terrorist organization called the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. This is the head of one of the most visible, most respected, in quotes, Palestinian human rights groups, Al-Haq, with a lot of money to lobby for their agenda, which is exactly the agenda of hating Israel, of looking for the destruction of Israel, using that same language, and very closely intertwined with Human Rights Watch, with Amnesty, with other groups. The second category are the church groups. And I have to say we were a little bit slow in picking up on this because it's somewhat masked, becoming a little more and more obvious. I mentioned Christian Aid in the UK. Truckail, I think I don't pronounce it exactly right, an Irish, massive, government-based Irish aid group. Humanitarian aid through a church. It's a Catholic church-based organization. ICO, which is an ecumenical Christian organization in Holland. Brit voor die Welt, one of a number of German government-funded humanitarian aid groups. The name tells you what they think they claim to be doing. And so many others, again, from the south to the north, there are 15 or so different, at least in each and every country, with budgets. ICO, the Dutch group that funds Electronic Intifada, one of the leaders of the BDS movement. The leader of Electronic Intifada is someone named Ali Abu Nima. He goes from campus to campus, university to university, promoting BDS. Obviously has a very large budget. His what's called a blog, but it's much more than that. It's a mini industry. Electronic Intifada obviously has a very large budget to employ a lot of people. It's not very visible, but we found out that at least in significant part, it's funded by this Dutch church organization that gets 100 million euros a year from the Dutch government, from the taxpayers. If anybody's here from Holland, this is something I would certainly protest about. And we've tried to get some information about this and to get members of parliament to take an interest in that. They fund Electronic Intifada and many, many other groups, also Al-Haq and many other groups. The churches are very deeply involved in the BDS movement. In many places, we had the Presbyterian divestment vote in the United States, the Anglican Church, many of these churches, progressive, liberal Protestant churches, but also Caritas, Vatican-based, a Catholic-based NGO is very involved in that. Pax Christi, another Catholic organization, funneling millions upon millions of dollars in other currencies into organizations like Zochrot, which is an Israeli organization which nobody heard of until they got $1 million a couple of years ago. That's how it works. That's how they got into the New York Times and the AFP and the Washington Post and Haaretz and every place else, because they suddenly got a lot more money from these church organizations. Sabeel, whose leader, Naim Atik, Palestinian Christian, goes around the world using very blatant classical theological, that's where the 2 points meet, as Robert Ristich and others have pointed out, classic theological anti-Semitic themes, saying things like the suffering of the Palestinians is the equivalent of the daily crucifixion of Christ. Israel, I had a PowerPoint and we don't have the facilities, but there are Christmas cards that are being distributed every year based on the theme of the apartheid wall, the separation, the anti-terror, no mention of terrorism in any of these things. And you have Israeli soldiers and, of course, Jesus and his family coming to Bethlehem on Christmas and being stopped at the checkpoint by these terrible Israeli soldiers. These are classic theological themes which are promoted year after year throughout Europe. And Sabeel, the Presbyterians, and other groups are very much involved in one other aspect which has to be taken into account. In many cases, you have a handful of people who stand up and say, I'm Jewish, and you're right. Israel is a terrible country. Israel commits war crimes. Israel commits apartheid and genocide and other things. A group like the Jewish Voices for Peace, and it always comes down to money. $1 million all of a sudden from a secret donor gets them to travel to all of these places where they're honored guests to provide the fig leaf of what the Presbyterians and others, Anglicans, think is legitimacy because, well, we can't be anti-Semitic because we have a couple of Jews. Now, we're not even sure that the majority of the members of the Jewish Voices of Peace are even Jewish. Another secretive organization. But that shows you how deep this process works and how much the money feeds it. The third framework, and again, I know I'm doing this in very short order. I'm waiting for the gavel to come down. The third framework are the medical NGOs. What could possibly be worse? It's even worse than being responsible for killing Christ. That those terrible Jews at the checkpoint, the Israelis, are killing Palestinian babies before they're born by not allowing their mothers to get through the checkpoints. Or, as was advertised and written about a few years ago, causes diabetes in Gaza. There are reams and reams. There are hundreds of articles, many of which were published in in what is called the most prestigious British medical journal, The Lancet, and not too many behind the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, with classic blood libels, vitriolic blood libels, without a shred of evidence. And just to show you how this works and how deep the anti-Semitic theme is in this, in July of 2014, in the middle of the war, what do they call it? Protective Edge. I don't like those names, Protective Edge, Tzuk Eitan. But in the middle of the war, the Lancet published a very visible letter to the people of Gaza. The editor, Richard Horton, who was in Israel doing a little bit of attempting to save his name and his job a little bit a few weeks ago, and will be back again, published this letter, which was signed by 5 doctors, and then 20 more, 30 more added their names to it. It turns out that 2 of those doctors, who are regular contributors to the Lancet, to this anti-Semitic theme which comes up month after month, are fans and members of the David Duke fan club. David Duke, if any of you don't know who he is probably the most well-known white supremacist anti-Semite in the world, at least in the United States. They were circulating videos on an email list. And those emails, the video, talks about everything is the Zionists control everything. The Zionists control the media, CNN. These are all Zio. Zio this and Zio that. It is the crudest anti-Semitism imaginable. And these were the signatories of that letter. Richard Horton, the editor, came to Haifa after he was caught. And it was, again, the way we got it out there was because it was published in the Daily Telegraph in the UK. It was naming and shaming, a point that I will make at the end, because this can be countered. And when he was caught, he rushed over for the first time, found somebody to invite him, went to Rambam Hospital, and said he deeply, deeply regretted the publication of this letter because it created friction. It created a divide. Not because it was anti-Semitic, not because it was filled with lies, not because it promoted the type of violence and hatred of Israel and of Jews that we see. The editor should no longer be the editor after this history. The owners, the publishers of the Lancet, the Elsevier Corporation, should issue an apology and start from scratch. And there are many others in this framework as well. The fourth framework is the humanitarian NGOs. Humanitarian groups do wonderful things, right? They bring food, they bring shelter. If there's an earthquake, if there is a humanitarian disaster, if there's a flood, tsunami, if there's a war, and there are millions of people from Syria that have to camp out in the cold in Jordan or in Turkey, they bring them tents and food. And they help the poor people of Gaza reconstruct. Not because They can't, Hamas, the leadership, the political organization there can't help them. They're too busy testing more rockets and building more concrete tunnels to attack Israel. So Oxfam goes and helps them. Oxfam has a budget of about $500 million a year. $500 million, 500, I think it's dollars and maybe pounds, and the numbers at that point become irrelevant. But Oxfam is deeply, deeply involved in demonization and BDS. Israel's depriving the poor people of Gaza, the poor people, the poor Palestinians, of their livelihood, of protection. They get to what they call root causes. What's the root cause of the suffering? It's Israeli occupation. It's settlements. History always starts in 1967. They know nothing. I met with a group of Oxfam volunteers or officials, they weren't volunteers, who live in Gaza. They know nothing, at all, nothing about Sderot, and nothing about treatment of Palestinians, Syrians in Israeli hospitals. What they know is a standard Palestinian narrative, which Israel's responsible for, and they campaign in the European Union, in the European Parliament, and other places, and all the parliaments throughout Europe, calling for boycotts of Israel, of guidelines, on campuses. Oxfam UK, Oxfam Novib, another Dutch government-funded organization, 90% of that comes from the Dutch government, is a major, major participant in the BDS movement. So if you look at all of this together, you see where all the money is feeding in. And to me, that's one of the keys. I think the key that we have to do to fight back, to defeat what is a very, very serious war, political war, through the abuse, the exploitation of the instruments and the language of human rights, of humanitarian aid, of medical assistance, all of these areas, of religion, church, and others. What we have to do, first of all, is name and shame these organizations. And every time that happens, we see a success. It's not easy to do. But if we can name and shame a church group, and I think we've made some progress with the Presbyterians for their role in this, and the funders of these groups, we've decreased the level of the attacks against us. It's a long, difficult process. Going to Brussels and explaining to the members of Parliament where their money goes. It goes to hate under the facade of peace. It goes to boycotts under the facade of humanitarian aid. If the European Union and its member states were to stop, 90%, 80% maybe of our problems would become manageable or disappear, being a little bit awfully optimistic. And that's the second point. You name and shame the organizations. Well, let me just make that as very specific. It's not just about going to their funders. When Robert Bernstein, the founder of Human Rights Watch, was shown what his organization was doing, it took him a couple of years, he denounced that organization. When Judge Richard Goldstone finally understood that his report with his name on it was based on lies from 50 different NGOs, and most particularly from the Human Rights Watch, which he was associated with, he wrote his article basically renouncing his own report. Naming and shaming is a successful process. And the second part is following the money. Going to the members of Parliament in each and every European country and each and every agency of the European Union and saying, you say your money is going for good things, and in many cases they don't know where the money is going. They have no idea. And that is also a failure of governance. You are responsible. If you sign a piece of paper that says I'm giving $1 or $1 million or $100 million to a framework, you're responsible for every dollar that's spent. And if the organization hides that information from you, then you should demand and get it. Slowly we're making some progress with the Europeans because of that process of naming and shaming and following the money. It has to be done a lot more. I can't say that I'm optimistic. I'm not going to end on an optimistic note. But I think, as in other wars, if you have the right weapons and you have a better sense of the enemy's strategy and its capabilities and better intelligence capabilities, it's a war that can be won and has to be won. Thank you.